Hi everyone, welcome back to Novel Nomad and welcome to my Victober wrap-up. Now I had a wonderful Victober this year. It was so much fun. I got to do 3 buddy reads and I got quite a lot of different and various Victorian titles read this year. First off, I'm just going to go through the books that I did read, the books that I didn't get to read from my list, and the books that I want to read for Victober next year. So the first book I managed to read in the month of October for Victober was The Goblin Market, poems by Christina Rossetti. Now The Goblin Market I have read before, but I haven't been able to read many of her other works, and it was absolutely beautiful to be able to read it in this stunning folio society edition. So not only did I have the joy of having these beautiful illustrations accompanying the poems, but it really gave another element to the imagery and the depth of the poem itself. Now a lot of the poems are about a woman's perspective on life, on love, on sisterhood, and that was quite fascinating to me because this focus always seems to be highly romanticized by many Victorian authors, but to have it from a female perspective as well within poetry, to be this very short, succinct narrative was just beautiful. Her use of words is lovely. I really loved how she could turn a phrase, but I have to admit my absolute favourite was The Goblin Market. I did have a few others in the collection that I love, especially Winter My Secret. I think it is such a beautiful but mischievous little poem, but The Goblin Market is really wonderful. It encapsulates elements of English folklore into the story itself, but also there's always a support for other women. There's always a strength behind women's friendships and the love between women. So I thought that was really, really beautifully expressed. Next, I read Trail of the Serpent by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. I read that with a lovely group of ladies, but unfortunately not everyone enjoyed it. It was definitely a sensationalist novel from the Victorian period where you followed a very villainous character as he moved through Victorian society and moved up. There was a detective element. We really thought it was going to be more of one of the early mysteries. There was a detective in it. He was an incredibly interesting detective because he was mute and he could only speak through sign language, and he actually saved a baby and it got a nurse for the baby and she could also speak sign language. So their little relationship and dynamic was really fascinating. However, the main focus was on the dastardly deeds of this other character and basically his eventual downfall, which is quite frequent for Victorian works. But I have to admit, it dragged so much. I skim read so much of that novel. It was not funny, but I really enjoyed it to begin with. I thought Mary Elizabeth Braddon, I have read her Lady Audley's Secret and I loved it. The gothic elements in that one, the use of atmosphere and the element of her writing is very, very much present in The Trail of the Serpent, but it is not honed, it is not well crafted. So this also being her very first novel she ever released is quite understandable. So whilst it was an interesting read to see how ridiculous at times a Victorian sensationalist novel could be, it was not one that I greatly enjoyed, nor one that I would recommend. I think I gave it 2 stars in the end just for the beauty of her writing at times, but the plot was atrocious. It could have been edited down to at least a novella at most. Next, I moved on to one that absolutely captured my heart and reignited my love for Victorian literature after The Trail of the Serpent, and that was Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Brontë. This was so amazing. The last time I read it, I had to read it really, really quickly and I just had to get the basic elements, but I allowed myself a week. I gave myself enough time to really sink into this novel, and I thoroughly enjoyed it from the character's perspective. Also the fact that it's written by Gilbert, who is seen as an outsider, so it is using some of those gothic elements of layering, removing the readers from the direct character of interest themselves, being the tenant of Wildfell Hall. It follows Gilbert, who is a country gentleman, country farmer, and he is enchanted by the new tenant of Wildfell Hall, which is Helen Graham. Now, what I love about Helen is she's an incredibly strong character, and there is such an honesty to her character, and that just carries you through the entire novel. She is not at once, she doesn't lie to herself, she doesn't try to hide or pretend things are getting better. She is incredibly honest to herself and the situation. So you follow this mysterious Helen as she comes into the local neighbourhood in Yorkshire, but she also brings a young boy, and they all believe her to be widowed. But what Gilbert soon finds out is that she is not, and she's in fact escaping a abusive relationship. There is an element of abuse of Helen's position, of her own independence, of her place, and her husband is a drunkard. He gambles away money, and he really has absolutely no moral compass, and he doesn't really believe he needs to, and he constantly lies to her over and over again, and there's just this slowly breaking down of trust. So Helen really takes into this characterization of a young girl who is swept away by a charming romantic man who she believes she can reform. So it's really taking those ideals of the Byronic character that was romanticized in her and Bronte's sisters' works by Emily and also Charlotte Bronte, and having this idea that a woman can reform a man. And it really breaks it down. She really starts to explore this idea that it is a faulty idea that you believe that your piety and purity can really change someone, that, or your beliefs in what they could be is really, you're not seeing who they truly are. But Helen stays true to herself. She stays true to the person that she is, and she moves on from that. So a little bit of a spoiler, so skip ahead if you don't want to know what happens in this book. But what I loved is that Helen and Gilbert found each other, and they really truly are matched well because they have similar temperaments. They are able to talk to each other. There's almost an equality of feeling. Even though he thinks he is beneath her in status, she really finds an equality of soul and purpose with Gilbert. So that's what I found utterly fascinating, is that what Anne Bronte focuses on isn't really this big romance, but rather finding someone who truly speaks to you, who truly sees who you are, and is truly comforting to your soul. Next, I snuck in one of my non-fictions, which was Night Walks by Dickens. I thoroughly enjoyed this one. Of course, it has Dickens' usual flair for the extravagant wordage, but I have to admit it was really, really fascinating to see in these nights of insomnia, walking through London city streets through Dickens' eyes, and it was really fascinating to see how this city that is always in progress, there's always this new innovation happening, and how many people were being left behind. So it was really focusing on the poor and the destitute in London, but also the people who would work at different hours, and all the different workers and when they would have to go, and the people who would work on the streets, not just in the saying of prostitutes and things, but gaslighters, different people who had different roles. And it was just like this minutiae of London society and these elements of Victorian society that just kept the society functioning. So whilst we often read from either a gentle perspective, which is higher up in the threshold, this was looking at all these little workings and dealings which just made society function, which was utterly fascinating. So I definitely recommend this one. It was a great short read. It really threw me out of the Yorkshire and Victorian countryside into the cityscape, which is perfect for the next book. The next book was Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell. This was quite a fascinating one. I did read this with a fair few lovely booktubers who I'll link all down below. Anyone I buddy read with will be linked down below. Please check out their channels. I had such a fantastic time talking to all these amazing people. You just have to go check them out. So please do. But what I really loved about reading Elizabeth Gaskell is that I did read Wives and Daughters earlier this year, which I utterly adored. It was just such a beautiful novel. But to see one of Elizabeth Gaskell's earlier works, I think this was one of her first novels, and apparently it was one of her favourites. And so within our discussions as we're going through, it very much started off as a social commentary. It is set in Manchester, and it follows Mary Barton, who is the daughter of a mill worker or a factory worker, and she ends up managing to find work as a seamstress. but it really follows her life, and not only her life but the life of many other people within the community around her. But it is also quite interesting how Elizabeth Gaskell looks at the conditions of the working man themselves. She really starts to hone in and break down on all these different ideas that whilst the working class might not have the same possessions or same look or characteristics as the wealthier people who she called the reader, they also shared many of the same values as well. So she was trying to make them on equal footing, which I found incredibly fascinating. So the moral standing of many of the working class was on equal footing, but they're also more charitable, which I found an interesting element to attach. So whilst the social commentary is pervasive for most of the book, right towards the end it gets to more of a mystery romance novel, which is fantastic. But of course I didn't pick that up until one of the fellow buddy readers pointed it out, which was really, really interesting because I effortlessly flowed into that genre and it really picked up for me. I think the plot itself is a little bit jumbled. In a way, the pacing is a little bit stilted at times, but it really was fascinating, especially considering that the book was going to be called John Barton, and I think where Elizabeth Gaskell actually wanted to title the book John Barton, and to see how that reflects on the attitudes of the characters and how they are depicted. But I thought this was quite well done. The depiction of the female characters, whilst I did enjoy some of the agency they were provided, it also did slip into that classic Victorian ideals of you can't actually have a straight conversation with anyone because it defies sensibility, which is so frustrating. So that would have to be one of my most hated Victorian tropes, where all this drama could have been resolved with one simple conversation between two of the main characters. But otherwise, it was fantastic good fun. Next, I jumped into another buddy read with the lovely Carolyn, and it was reading The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. I did actually end up finishing this. It was such a heaving struggle every single day, because I started off with 5 chapters, which was fine, went to 6 for the Tuesday, and for the rest of the week I was to read 8 chapters a day, and they are chunky chapters. So it was really quite interesting. As I was quite intrigued throughout this entire book, it didn't really lose me at times. It did lose the direction of the investigation at times, but I think because you were so invested in the characters that I really didn't mind. I have to admit though, some of the characters were quite fascinating, but what I loved was the multiple narrators, and what that proved is that everyone has a different opinion of the other person and their opinion on that person within a crisis. So you start off with the narration of Gabriel Betteridge, who Carolyn and I both agreed was a bit of a weird old man. He just has his opinions on women were quite backwards, especially for the time, because I'd read so many books written by women authors that didn't have this opinion of women to be so detrimental. But it was quite interesting to see his perspective on Rachel, because she is one of the main female characters in this novel. And she is really depicted in multiple ways. So not only is she depicted as someone mysterious and unknown, there's also a loyalty towards her, but is an unknown of feeling in Betteridge. Then it moves on to one of Rachel's cousins, which views every action of Rachel with this kind of independent will that she has as being defiant to a goodly sensibility of a woman in their time. And then to move on again to have another perspective of Rachel. And what I really loved is how much I started to love Rachel by the end of this book. It really was hard not to love her, because she was such a strong and honest character, and she really didn't take anything lying down. So she had suffered lots of emotional upheaval in this novel, but she really stayed true. So that's what I loved coming out of this novel. So whilst I didn't love this, I still was utterly enthralled by it. So I gave it about 4 stars. It was a good read. Next, I jumped straight into What Katie Did by Susan Coolidge, and this was such a lovely read. I think after all the quite dark, mysterious reads, I had to go into something that was a little bit slower, a little bit more children orientated, and also gentle. was beautiful. It was such a lovely way to finish off the month. This was one of my last novels that I read during Victober, but I really thoroughly enjoyed it, and I kind of wish I read it when I was younger, during the days that I was discovering Anne of Green Gables, but I still thoroughly appreciated it now. It is perfect for anyone who likes Little Women and also Anne of Green Gables, as there's a very spirited female character who is growing up and really has to grow into herself and become someone who she'd never believed she could be when she was younger. So I thought this was absolutely beautiful and really, really gentle Victorian read. Next, I picked up The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell, and I was pleasantly surprised to realise how spooky these stories were. It was quite a fantastic little gothic novel, or ghost story I should say. It was actually part of the Christmas household edition that when it was first published, but it was perfect because I read it on the 30th of October, and leading so close to Halloween, it was perfect for the time. The last book I finished on the 31st of October, and my last Victober read for the month was The Yellow Wallpaper. I was slowly reading this book throughout the month. I would give myself a few short stories a week to get through, but I utterly adore this. I ended up reading most of the short stories, even though they go into the Edwardian period. It was so horribly fascinating to read these, and I loved The Yellow Wallpaper. If you don't want to read the full collection, I'm sure you can find a little black classic of The Yellow Wallpaper. I highly recommend it. It's such a freaky little psychological story. It is fantastic, and the gothic element was just chilling. So I really thoroughly enjoyed this one. Also, it has really good strong feminist elements to all the stories, where she's really exploring female independence and female ownership, as through marriage really female ownership is given away, and also that female virtue is demanded by men and also judged by men. So many of these stories were looking into the female condition and also the female values at the time, what was really considered to be feminine and what was not. So I really utterly enjoyed this one. It was perfect for the end of October, but I really recommend The Yellow Wallpaper if you do want to pick up one of Charlotte Perkin Gilman's stories. Alright, so those are the books I read, and the ones that I didn't get to was 3 of the little ones. I didn't get to read Femme Fatale, Mary Shelley's Matilda, or George Eliot's Silly Novels by Lady Novelists, which I'm sure that Tale of the Serpent by Mary Elizabeth Braddon would have heavily featured in this one. I think Mary Elizabeth Braddon does feature in this novel, and I can kind of see why with that novel, but I think what I find interesting about George Eliot is she was always wanting to have progress made by female novelists, and she was quite critical of other female novelists. So I would still be interested to read this one, but yeah, unfortunately I didn't get around to these ones, but they are short, sharp, shiny reads that I could read anytime during the year. Now, on to what I want to read next for possibly my next Victober or possibly sooner. Now, the first one is definitely going to be the next in the Katie series by Susan Coolidge. It's what Katie did next, and I'm really excited to read this one. It's another short novel. It's going to be such a sweet read, and I think it'll be very comforting. I'm going to read it probably over the Christmas time when I'm on Christmas holidays, and it's going to be really, really gentle and lovely to read. Next, I want to read more Gaskell. I'm not sure which title I'm going to choose next, but I'm pretty certain it's going to be Sylvia's Lovers. I picked up this edition because it is so touted by Kate Howe, and I love Kate Howe's recommendations that I just cannot wait to get into this one. It's going to be so great. I really thoroughly enjoy Elizabeth Gaskell's writing style. I think her use of prose is stunning. So I think Sylvia's Lovers would be a very good progression into my next Gaskell read. Also, I want to read more Brontes. I don't have Agnes Grey on my shelf, but I definitely will pick up a copy because I loved Anne Bronte's Tenant of Wildfell Hall. But I really want to read Villette by Charlotte Brontë as well. This one, I was either considering to read this one or The Professor, but I have got some pretty good recommendations from Katie from Books and Things and also Kate Howe that Villette is probably one of the next places I want to go with my Brontë reading. Something a little bit closer to home is going to be Handfasted by Catherine Helen Spence. This one I managed to snag at a local secondhand bookstore, and Catherine Helen Spence was one of the Victorian women based in South Australia who actually got votes for women and actually got female suffrage in the 1890s. So Catherine Helen Spence was quite a successful Australian journalist, novelist and socialist of the time. So Handfasted is really her way of looking at how social values of marriage and women's rights is really being put into play within the times. So, and she manages to put it within a romantic novel, so I think this is going to be quite fun. And lastly, I think I'll definitely be reading some more Thomas Hardy in the coming year. I have only read Tessa d'Urberville's and Mayor of Casterbridge, both of which I thoroughly enjoyed. See my favourite villains for quite a surprising villain who I find in the Tessa d'Urbervilles. But I want to read more Hardy. He did write a lot of works and I do find his work quite fascinating. So this is Under the Greenwood Tree, but I also think I'll be buddy reading Return of the Native with some lovely booktubers who I read Mary Barton with. Alright, so that was my Victober. Let me know your favourite books of Victober or any of these that you'd like to check out. I'll be very happy to talk to you about them. But thank you all for joining me. I'll see you next time. Bye!